By the time he finally left the cathedral, it was already getting dark. It was not even all that late yet, but he supposed the season still hadn't shifted into summer yet. It made him start to think back to when they first arrived. The flush of summer was just finishing and autumn was about to start, and it made him wonder what it would be like to experience the summertime all over again, from the beginning this time. As with so much else, it was easy to guess the answer would be some variation of more evocative than in New York, but it was nice to realize that this was going to be just one of the many summers he was going to experience with her. The first time drifting from spring to summer in a foreign country, and then after that, another autumn. He preferred this climate. He never liked the winters in New York. The chapped lips and watery noses, piercingly cold rooms, and chill blains from spending far too long around open fires or drying out from electric heaters. For a few moments, he found himself remembering how Florence had somehow suited the colder cloaked seasons. With her pale skin, dark eyes, and luminous hair like snow, she could easily be a fairy tale snow queen from a novel or a movie. He remembered her wearing his big coat that time he took her to the cathedral to see Diane, a spectacle which would have looked outright ludicrous on any other woman, which even she still managed to pull off, and promptly started to smile, the first genuine one he had managed to muster since leaving her this morning. The thought of her was also a helpful reminder that Florence said that she would cook for him when he got back, and he gave a quick eye roll at himself for telling her to stay inside and be good, because now it would be up to him to get some ingredients. Normally, she would plunder his recipe collection for something easy, but maybe he could buy some slightly more intricate ingredients to encourage her to make something more complex, guided by him. Symbolically important, an example of the merging of their two worlds. What though? If it were up to Florence, they would either be getting expensive takeout or eating burgers and fries. Even with the symbolic merging of their two worlds, he had some standards left. For a few moments he stood there in the shadows, thoughtfully chewing his thumbnail as he tried to devise something suitable he could suggest for her to make. Italian would be a good choice, although perhaps a bit obvious. Not to mention that the type of meal she was capable of preparing would be a little limited, and he didn't want to cause her unnecessary stress or pressure or make her feel like he was micromanaging her. The ideal compromise seemed to be something that he wasn't familiar with cooking himself and that wouldn't take a long time. Eventually, he decided on a Cajun-themed meal as a solution. Admittedly, he couldn't imagine himself being blown away by it, but it ticked his two boxes, and she would feel as if she had made something special and unique. Fried fish, perhaps, with corn rice salad, and she would pick beer, non-alcoholic of course, instead of wine drunk in her native way, straight out of the bottle with wedges of lime in the top. And of course, he would pretend to be faintly appalled by this, but also being harshly reminded, and quite rightly so, of his alcohol-fueled, excruciatingly lonely life before she came into it, when drinking directly out of any bottle with liquor inside was a near-daily occurrence. Standards be hanged. Desperate times lead to desperate measures. Then they would laugh it off, and he would guide her on how to slice the fish, and then delightedly eat it all with relish, for no other reason than because she was the one who made it for him. At the image of it, he could already feel himself starting to grow more cheerful. He had left it far too late to go to La Merced Market, his insisted venue for anything food-related, but one of the larger supermarkets would still be open, and he now took out his phone to start an inventory of all the ingredients she would need: mustard, paprika, and cayenne pepper, with sole instead of cod as a compromise to his superior taste buds. Damn, how long had he been standing there planning this? He had never gone to this much trouble thinking about someone else other than himself, not even Heather. But he pushed the guilty twinge aside and retrieved his phone again so he could fire off a quick text to Florence letting her know he would be late. He told her he loved her and was looking forward to seeing her soon. then was about to add something sarcastic about Giovanni before hovering for a few seconds and hitting send, without typing anything further. Mocking Giovanni felt like a betrayal of that scene in the church today, of Giovanni's concerned face and kind hands, even though it was a consideration that was ultimately meaningless, seeing how Angus was still poised to do so much worse to him, because he wasn't he? He was about to destroy him. Nevertheless, he was glad he didn't write it. Instead, he just returned his phone to his pocket, turning around in preparation to leave, only to find himself stalling for a second time as one by one every single hair on his neck stood on end at a deeply unnerving disruption in the darkness, the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. To be fair, it was not like it was especially loud, barely even audible above the sound of the hum of traffic in the distance, but it was definitely there where it shouldn't be, and he spun around sharply on his heels at the sudden, panicked awareness that he wasn't alone. At first he couldn't see anything beyond a sifting blend of shadows, but then there was a soft crunch of shoes against gravel as the shadows solidified and slowly turned into the two Mexican ministers who had been hovering around him so persistently ever since the death of Luis. He threw a fierce scowl at them, acutely resentful at being startled, and the tallest one took a quick step forward in response. His glasses reflected the street light and made him look like he had two burning holes in his head instead of his eyes.
Ex-Ministro Principal Brady. Buenas noches. A moment of your time.
The way this was phrased implied an order, not a request. But Angus still strode forward anyway, in a bullish attempt to shove past them. Without missing a beat, the second one stepped forward too, then grimaced before clamping his hand down firmly on Angus's arm. Internally, Angus found himself wincing. Despite his spindly appearance, he was a lot stronger than he looked.
It will be quicker if you speak now. We know you have been avoiding us.
What are you talking about? I haven't been avoiding you.
This time their only reply was to smirk in unison, at which point he was forced to concede that they were so stupid and arrogant that they genuinely believed his recent absence had been in some way related to them. In happier circumstances he might have found this funny, but right now it was very far from that. Instead, it was incredibly frustrating, and for a few moments it required every shred of self-control he possessed not to simply yell at them to go and fuck themselves. The problem, as much as he disliked admitting it, was that it was deeply unnerving too, because he knew very well that stupidity and arrogance were a dangerous combination, sometimes lethally so. He would far rather deal with cruel intelligence because cruel intelligence could be reasoned with. Stupidity, on the other hand, was nearly always stubborn and brutal.
It's late. You'll have to wait till tomorrow.
The second minister shook his head, slow and deliberate, like he was the one who was too idiotic to understand what they were asking.
No, not tomorrow. You talk to us now.
Angus made an impatient sound between his teeth, but when he attempted to pull away again, the first minister clamped his hand down even harder to stop him. The minister smiled a bit as he did it, and Angus could see the wet gleam of teeth in the darkness. Brute strength aside, it probably wouldn't be that hard to fight him off, but the obvious glee of potential confrontation made Angus feel that this was exactly what they wanted him to do. After all, assaulting a fellow minister was a crime, and if reported, a single punch could result at the very least in a trial.
We are hoping you can help us. It is about the death of Lorenzo Aguilar.
By some miracle, Angus's expression didn't alter by a single flicker, yet for the first time he was aware of a genuine chill of fear.
What about him?
His secretary came by my office today. Senora Garcia, a nice lady. Very helpful. She has already been interviewed, as you know. She was only here to sign some documents, but as she was leaving, she said something very interesting to me. She pointed at the cover of our last church bulletin, and she tells me, I'm sure I know that man. He came into Lorenzo's office a couple of times. Si, I'm sure it is him.
She's mistaken.
Yes, that is what I thought too. There was no record of anyone else in the files. All the tenants were accounted for. I put this to Senora Garcia, and she tells me, Oh, that man and his daughter always paid in cash. They had a private arrangement with Lorenzo. Like I said, ex-chief minister, she recognized you.
And like I said, she's mistaken.
Angus was praying silently in thanks that Senora Garcia had not seen the photo of Florence on the whiteboard, as there would be little hope that she wouldn't have recognized her as well. The longer Giovanni took to go public on her appearance, the better. He would do everything in his power to encourage it. The minister gave him a thin smile, lips stretched across his gums in a way that looked faintly reptilian.
Yes, I am sure you are right, senor. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. And that is why I am sure you will have no objection to following a police order that we have here, asking you to voluntarily give a sample of your DNA. It will be very quick and easy to eliminate you, yes? If you have nothing to hide.
Is this some sort of joke? Absolutely not.
This time they just stood there without speaking, gazing at him with all the wordless contempt they had spent the last few weeks perfecting. And somehow the silence managed to be even more disturbing than the previous barrage of accusations had been. The thing was, he didn't even think they really believed it. If there was a genuine lead for Lorenzo's murder, then they would have taken it directly to Giovanni or Carli by now. Possibly even their own Policía a la Iglesia representative if they didn't trust nepotism not to intervene on his behalf with the latter. They were simply infected with the same resentful dislike of him as Luis had, and no doubt were now gleefully congratulating themselves for stumbling onto an ideal opportunity to humiliate Angus for a few hours as a punishment for it. He had got it so wrong, hadn't he? So wrong. He was certain that their hostility was linked to Luis's murder, and now it turned out that not only was this not the case, it was not even really linked to Lorenzo's. It was little more than a spiteful grudge that had spent months searching for an outlet. And if Florence hadn't gotten to Luis first, then he would almost certainly have been here too. Who knows? They might have even been plotting something similar together whilst he was still alive. It seemed more plausible. And the fact that the fucking hero of the Pope's task force cover of their bulletin was the prompt for it felt like the final bit of perverse poetic irony.
You are refusing?
Correct. I'm refusing.
Then it seems we have a difficulty, doesn't it?
Yes, I guess it does.
As Angus was speaking, he reached into his pocket to take out his phone, refusing to break eye contact the entire time. As strategies went, this admittedly wasn't his preference, and given the choice, he would far rather deal with things alone. But desperate times call for desperate measures. Again. And seeing how he didn't have a choice, there was no question a quick resolution would be worth every fragment of lost pride in the meantime. Ultimately, the two ministers had no real basis for any of this, and he thought deep down they knew it too. Which meant there was still a decent chance that the voice of authority was exactly what was needed to remind them. His lingering fear was that it might be a bit too late by now, but Giovanni, thank the heavens, picked up almost immediately.
Can you come down? I've got a situation. No, not in Pusa. Just get here as soon as you can. I'm a few yards from the back of the cathedral.
He supposed he should probably have explained what was happening, but he already knew the ministers would insist on a recital when Giovanni got there, and somehow Angus couldn't face listening to the whole thing for a third time. So in the end he just hung up and stood there in stony-faced silence, vibrating with a potent mix of anger and adrenaline until Giovanni finally emerged from the building a few minutes later and came striding over towards them. Sure enough, the ministers quickly launched into the same outline they had already told Angus, this time garnished with more dramatic pauses and weighty stares for Giovanni's benefit, presumably because now they knew they would have to make it as plausible as possible. Angus guessed that they hoped they were coming over to Giovanni as compelling, and which made it no small consolation that Giovanni's expression throughout the whole thing confirmed that he thought it was the biggest crock of bullshit he had ever heard in his life.
So that is the situation. Either ex-Chief Minister Brady comes with us voluntarily.
He paused, and then slowly swiveled his head to glance at Angus again.
or we perform a citizen's arrest and take a sample by force.
The sheer relish with which he said force immediately confirmed what Angus had already suspected, namely that this whole thing was part of a sadistic game to put him in his place in revenge for upstaging them. Admittedly, it was on a far larger scale, yet it still made his thoughts stray back to Luis again, and the time he had tried to march him into Giovanni's office. Aggressively hostile, deliberately demeaning, and all for no greater crime than being found in the parking lot after hours. It was so easy to imagine how much Luis would have enjoyed himself if he had been here, and yet again showed how painfully wrong Angus had been in assuming their motivations. He thought all the staring had come from a place of suspicion when it was nothing more than envy and aversion all along. A part of him could almost feel sorry for himself, that it was easier to believe he was suspected of a crime than to admit that yet another group of people found him so inherently off-putting and unlikable that they would go out of their way to persecute him because of it.
And where the hell is your probable cause? Ex-Chief Minister Angus Brady is a senior member of the clergy with 40 years of dedication to our Lord.
Giovanni paused and then gave the ministers one of his more contemptuous glares.
You're going to need a damn sight more than a tiny black and white photo and a witness statement that is 3 months out of date.
This is not New York, Cardinal Pasha.
The minister's resolve seemed unshakable. Internally, he could feel the first flare of hope already starting to crumble.
You observe your own procedures, yes? Leave us to follow ours. We have been to the Policía a la Iglesia, and he agrees we have grounds to go over your heads if necessary in obtaining DNA for this potential suspect.
Giovanni emitted an angry snorting noise and then glared at them both for a second time before putting his hand on Angus's shoulder and discreetly drawing him aside.
If they've gone to Policía a la Iglesia, then there is not much I can do. Maybe just do what they are asking, huh? I know it's ridiculous, okay? I know it is. But it might just be the quickest way we can get this sorted out.
Angus opened his mouth to object, and Giovanni made a soothing sound between his teeth in what was presumably a request to hear him out.
I'll call their chief minister first thing tomorrow. They won't get away with this. We can put in a formal complaint.
No way am I agreeing. I don't trust either of them. How do I know they haven't bribed the Policía a la Iglesia and he will switch samples?
Oh, come on. Why would they do that?
I don't know, Giovanni. Why make such a baseless accusation in the first place?
Considering their earlier conversation, he knew what he was about to say was a cheap shot. But things were getting urgent now, and he no longer had time to play nice.
Let's face it, it would hardly be the first time people had underestimated me and my faith.
For a few seconds, Giovanni narrowed his eyes.
Damn it, Angus,
The look said.
Why did you have to bring that up?
Angus could tell Giovanni was frustrated that he was making things difficult, and he couldn't even really say he blamed him. From Giovanni's perspective, it was easy to imagine how Angus must have sounded. Pugnacious and prideful, stubbornly refusing a solution that was relatively straightforward and could get him exonerated on the spot. Fortunately, he was also used to Angus's pugnaciousness, and to be fair, pridefulness, and on this occasion was going to do what Angus needed most from him by simply accepting defeat and rolling with it. Frustrated or not, Giovanni was still on Angus's side. Surreptitiously, he now gave Angus's shoulder an encouraging pat and then turned back around again, drawing himself up to his full height before launching into full preacher mode.
This is an absolute travesty. You've got no motive and no evidence, no grounds for demanding a sample. And if he won't give you one voluntarily, then you have no right to detain him yourself. The pair of you have exactly 1 minute to get out of here. Otherwise, I will be calling your chief minister.
The whole time he was speaking, the focus finally shifted onto Angus, and Angus now used this as a chance to study both the minister's reactions more closely. The second one he thought was close to cracking. Possibly it was the threat of his chief minister that did it, but either way, it was obvious he felt that the entire thing had gone too far, and he would be happy to just take the offered escape route and go home. He would probably use it for a few months' worth of anecdotes to bitch about how arrogant and corrupt the North American clergy were, and how the sooner they all fuck off, the better. But he didn't truly care about it, and Angus knew if it were up to Minister Number 2, then Angus would be off the hook. Only it was not just up to him, and a glance at Minister Number 1 was enough to crush any strands of hope remaining, because this one was not backing down. This one resented Giovanni for the same reasons as he did Angus, even if he privately accepted that he had overplayed his hand. A single look at him was enough to confirm that Minister Number 1 would infinitely rather double down on the error and accept the consequences than ever admit he was in the wrong.
Then we shall have to settle this inside. Wouldn't you agree?
Before Minister Number 1 had even finished, he began reaching down into his pocket to retrieve what by this point was close to unthinkable, an actual pair of handcuffs, gleaming soft and sinister in the moonlight.
There's no need to resist, Angus Brady. We have the authority to arrest you under civilian law for obstructing the course of justice.
Angus's heart gave a terrible, sickening lurch at the sight of them, and Giovanni sucks in his breath with an angry huff, and then forces his way between them both as a kind of human shield.
What do you think you're doing? You can't just arrest him.
Perdoneme, signore,
Minister Number 1 sneered.
but that is exactly what we can do. You have no authority here.
So this was it then, he thought with a sudden resignation. It was going to happen. There was no stopping it now. In a way, it was quite striking that he had neither moved nor spoken for this entire time. Instead, he had been silently stood there, fixed in place with a blank face and an eerie calmness which in reality he didn't remotely feel. Of course, he knew Florence had been careful to clean the scene and remove traces of their home from her clothes and shoes, but he also knew that he had been in that office. And yes, the cleaners would have been in countless times since he had, but what if there was still a trace of him there? He knew that he could not afford to take that chance, which meant the only option left for him was to fight his way out of there. It wouldn't be easy to subdue the both of them, but with the benefit of a surprise attack, he was reasonably sure he could manage it. On the other hand, what he couldn't yet admit to himself was that when he said 2, he really meant 3. Because whilst Giovanni's intervention was inevitable, he knew he was still not ready to acknowledge the reality of having to subdue him too. Except that he needed to, didn't he? He had to. He must. He understood that now. What other choice did he have? As of yet, he still hadn't moved. He still hadn't spoken. But in his head, he was already aware that he was saying goodbye. He was telling Giovanni he was sorry, that he didn't want it to end like this. Even that he had appreciated him, in his own strange way, because it was really going to happen now, wasn't it? It was impossible to avoid it any longer. His old self, the person Giovanni still believed him to be, was finally destined to die in front of him, choked to death by Angus's own hands, by revealing the truth of the type of person he had become. That he and Florence were together, it would destroy Giovanni, and even that was still the best case scenario, given that the alternative was getting overpowered by them 3 and then being dragged back inside the church, and towards life in prison. What if he failed? He found himself thinking, what if they took him away from Florence? What if? It was that more than anything. It was about her. Because at the forefront of his mind, acutely painful and prescient, is the awareness of how he would have to do this alone. The irony was almost unbearable because he knew he had done this to himself, that she had been following him for so long and protecting him, and now the one time he had asked her not to had turned out to be the one time that he needed her the most. All around them, the sounds of the city were still carrying on as normal. The cars continued to hum in the distance. There was a throb of music from some restaurant a few blocks away. The ministers and Giovanni are both still talking about Angus. Yet in a strange way, he was not aware of any of it, because all he could really focus on was the rapid, staccato pounding of his heartbeat in his ears. It was an eerie sort of voltage which thrummed and pulsed, and as he listened to the roar of the blood, He could hear inevitability because he knew by now that there was no more help for it. There was nothing else left. He wondered if this was the way euphoria was supposed to feel. It certainly seemed like it might be close to it, a rapturous, skittering anticipation which crackled and throbbed, yet at the same time was still seasoned with a darkly undeniable undertone of dread. How was that possible, though? It didn't even make sense. Surely it should be just one or the other. Already he had been scanning the sidewalk for anything he could use as a weapon, but of course there was nothing, and he didn't really expect there to be. He guessed that meant it needed to be done by hand then? Skin against skin. Strangely intimate yet brutally blunt force, erasing the restrictions of physical distance or mental detachment while still keeping control even in the ecstasy of losing it, righteous, rebellious, redolent with wrath, and all done with his own bare hands. He knew how much Florence would appreciate that if she were here. Because she would, wouldn't she? She would enjoy it all so much. It was always this particular scenario that appealed to her lately. By this point, his breath had sped up so much he felt slightly dizzy with it. The three of them had just been stood there arguing together the entire time, but it was only now that he deliberately turned his back on them to begin walking away down the street. He knew it was useless, of course. He knew they would try to stop him. The only real purpose was to draw them further from the cathedral, and whilst he had already made a start on it before Giovanni arrived, this newest attempt at least managed to add a bit more distance. Admittedly, it wasn't that much in total, not more than about 10 yards. Even so, there was a winding alleyway close by, which looked fairly secluded and should suffice for what he had in mind. Nothing but a bike leaning against the wall, some darkened windows. Surely it would be enough? Not that any of these mental bargains really mattered, of course, because it would have to be enough. He needed to make sure that it was. In this respect, his attention had grown so focused on what was waiting in store that when Minister Number 1 ran after Angus to roughly grab his shoulder, it barely even registered as something Angus had to respond to. Instead, Angus only glanced up at him, blinking mildly with surprise as if he couldn't believe the Mexican minister could be so rude, then just stood by in passive silence to watch the way the minister's lips curled back to show an angry, glistening expanse of teeth and gums.
You dare to walk away from us?
Quickly, Angus twisted his shoulder back until the minister lost his balance enough to drop the handcuffs and spat out a quick curse in Mexican and then jerked his head towards Minister Number 2 to pick them up.
You think you are above the law? You do, don't you? Maldita seas. You have no respect for us. You have shown us no respect since you have arrived.
Take your hands off of him now and put those cuffs away while you are at it. I will call the Pope directly and he can intercede on this matter. We can go inside like reasonable men without this turning into a circus.
They want it to turn into a circus. That's the entire point of this.
Giovanni threw Angus an uneasy glance. Angus's lack of emotion was concerning Giovanni, much in the same way it did to Florence. Giovanni thought this was a sign of approaching vehement anger and violence, and therefore he presumed Angus wasn't coping, even though in this case the exact opposite was true. And his calculated anger and violence was in fact a sign that he was coping a bit too well, slowly ramping everything down as Angus started to detach himself in preparation for the inescapable grimness of the task ahead. Minister Number 1, on the other hand, interpreted it a little differently, because he now curled his mouth into a sort of sneer before tightening his grip on Angus's shoulder and then delivering a punch right into Angus's face. He had probably been yearning to do that ever since he had first met Angus, but whilst Angus's fingers twitched with the urge to hit him back, it ended up being surprisingly easy to resist the temptation. The urgency of the situation meant Angus couldn't afford to miscalculate by a single second, and experience told him that it was still too early to escalate. Angus needed more room to maneuver, a clearer exit to run. Besides, letting them think he was too scared to retaliate should help him catch the ministers off guard. Angus just stood there with the same blank muteness as before. cheek tingling slightly in the cool night air and the taste of blood like copper in his mouth. For a few moments, Giovanni looked over and was shocked into genuine silence before abruptly snapping back to life again, with anger so intense Angus half expected to see it flaming off him in sparks. As Angus watched, he grabbed Minister Number One's shoulder and then yanked him away from Angus before roughly spinning him back around across the pavement. It was clear Giovanni wanted to help Angus, and of course he had, only not quite in the way that Giovanni thought. What Giovanni had really done for Angus was to clear him some of the space he needed, and by this point, a few more yards were all that was necessary before it would finally be enough to act.
Try that again, try that one more time, and I will make you sorrier than you have ever been in your life. You can kiss goodbye to your career.
The words of a cardinal might have fully hit home, because Minister Number 2 now made a nervous scraping noise deep in his throat, before putting a hand on his fellow clergyman's arm to mutter something in Mexican. It was too quiet for Angus to hear, but it was obvious from his face he was expressing his doubts about how the whole thing had gotten too far. Not that it mattered, though. Not his fear. Not his regret. None of it mattered at all, because by now it had grown painfully obvious that Minister Number 1 had exactly zero intention of ever allowing Angus to leave. It had become a point of personal pride for him too now, to see things through to the bitter end, and if anyone had asked Angus, he could have told them that himself. He understood pride, how fiercely implacable and relentless it could be, simply from having to struggle with it so many times in dealing with Florence. Although admittedly in this minister's case it had its origins in something far cruder and coarser, because whilst his own pride came from an innate state of superiority, Minister Number 1's was the exact opposite. His was merely a mask for inadequacy and self-doubt, and which is why Angus knew with such certainty he wasn't ever going to consider backing down. Even a complaint to his chief minister wouldn't deter him, because the chief minister would only tell him that he was wrong. Giovanni, on the other hand, and he supposed Angus as well, would make him feel dumb and silly. And that, clearly, was something that was completely unbearable for him. As if proving Angus's point, Minister Number 1 now angrily shook his colleague's hand away, before spinning around to face Giovanni again.
You are interfering, senor.
It was obvious how desperate he was to speak to Giovanni with the same contempt he did Angus, and how much he hated the fact that he couldn't quite dare.
This is not your business.
It's my task force, my team member, sent here by the Pope himself. Remind me again how this is not my business.
Indeed, it might be better to delay this. Ex-Chief Minister Brady could meet up with us for an interview tomorrow, perhaps with his attorney present.
Giovanni gave a satisfied nod, and Minister Number 1 glared again before letting all his breath rush out with an angry hiss.
Silencio. We do not delay. No waiting until tomorrow. We do it now.
Yes, we do.
Angus thought in numb agreement.
We do it right now.
His position wasn't ideal, but probably no position ever would be, and at least it met his minimum requirements of distance from the cathedral and freedom to move without constraint. Slowly and with a subtlety, Angus now began to reach into his pocket to take out his phone. As weapons went, it was very far from ideal, although he was still hoping it might prove effective when slammed against someone's temple at an angle and with force. Fists and feet would have to do the rest, and now the moment had finally arrived to act. He found himself surprisingly calm. Nothing but a grim, determined sense of fatalism that this was what needed to happen, and the sooner he got it over with, the better.
He is going to be arrested, and tender, and any more interference, Padre Pacha, then we arrest you too.
A single bead of sweat was starting to trickle down the back of Angus's neck. The anticipation was like a knife twisting into his lungs, slow and excruciating, yet still powerful enough to feel like a living thing, like a fifth person was in the street.
Keep it together, old man,
he thought urgently.
Keep it together. You'll never walk out of here if you don't.
Giovanni had stepped in front of Angus again, solid and dependable as a sort of human shield, but unlike last time, Angus forced himself not to catch his eye. The moment had come to detach himself now, because he already knew that he had to objectify him. He had to turn him into something that could be discarded. It was impossible to act how he needed to without doing so. By this point, Angus's grip on the phone had grown so hard it was almost painful as he slowly started to draw his arm up. Minister number 1 was the closest, so he would start with him. Take out the second one when he lunges forward, and then...
Oh fuck, what then? What do I do with Giovanni?
He knew he wanted revenge for what had happened in New York, but not like this. Not in this way. Giovanni needed to know about him and Florence first. Or was that the only reason? Had the previous fires of vengeance begun to burn low? For a few seconds, he let his eyes flit down the sidewalk, briefly overcome with a surge of hopelessness that he had been fighting so hard to suppress. Perhaps the unevenness of the cobblestones might be a last-ditch grasp at redemption. If he timed things right, it might be possible to just trip him over onto the ground without really having to hurt Giovanni at all. Angus's sense of absorption had grown so intense that it had consumed almost everything else, and it meant that at first he barely registered the way Minister number 1 had gone pale and rigid beside him. It didn't matter, and therefore Angus didn't see it. Just like he hardly heard the way Minister number 2's breath was hitching itself into a strangled gasp. Didn't see, didn't care, didn't notice. And in the end, it was only when Minister number 2 spoke that it was finally enough to snare Angus's attention away from his impending doom.
Dios mío, ¿cómo puede ser esto?
The words sputtered out of his mouth, abrupt and unexpected in the cool night air, and whilst they were not especially loud in themselves, the force of emotion behind them made them seem as stark and startling as a gunshot. Everyone immediately swung around to stare at him, and as Angus glanced at Minister number 2's face, Angus suddenly felt the first faint stirrings of hope, because this was an expression he had seen before. He recognized it. He knew what it meant, because it was the same way Carly looked in the alleyway when Florence first appeared, that unique blend of horror, fear, and disbelief. In a way, Angus did not dare look, because he so fiercely wanted it to be her, and he was not sure he could bear the crushing weight of disappointment that it wouldn't be. But then at the same time, he didn't want it to be Florence either, because he didn't want her to be here at all. He wanted her away from all this, safe and secure, and many miles from any possible danger. The sense of contradiction was almost physically painful. The wrenching urge of please, please, no, that for a brief moment it robbed him of any real ability to respond, and he simply stood there instead, listening to his pulse and counting his breaths, before finally turning to Giovanni. Unlike Angus, Giovanni didn't have a choice. He was facing the opposite direction. He had to see what was there. He knew Giovanni's expression would tell Angus the truth, and so he looked at him, and that's when he knew for sure. As Angus's own breath caught, he pivoted around on both heels, and it was at that precise moment Florence finally moved forward, breaking free from the shadows, one ominous step at a time, until she was standing right in front of them, with her face half illuminated in the moonlight. It gave her a distinctly eerie appearance that was supernatural and haunting, the silhouettes bouncing off each of her cheekbones to reveal an expression that was terrifyingly cold and impersonal. The only thing that was truly animated were her eyes. They had that burningly intense quality which almost made them seem as if they were gleaming, and he took a single look at her. And he didn't even need to hear her speak to immediately know how incredibly angry she was.
Well, fathers, forgive the interruption, but it honestly feels as if your God has forsaken you.
Florence's eyes drifted over to the dried blood on his lip. Oh shit, she was really angry now, wasn't she? She was fucking furious. It also seemed close to impossible that she was actually here, yet somehow it didn't matter anymore exactly why she was. In that moment, it didn't matter that she had ignored his request yet again by following him when he expressly told her not to. What mattered instead was the continuing good-bad contradiction. That on one hand he no longer needed to deal with this alone, and instead they could handle it together as a team, exactly as they ought to. But on the other was not only did he now have her and their unborn child's safety to consider as well as his own, but it was also clear that the time had come for her big reveal with Giovanni, and which for her sake he remained willing to accept, but for his own he was still not fully prepared for. Behind Angus, Giovanni muttered something sharp beneath his breath, and Florence's eyes promptly swiveled towards him as a smile flickered around her mouth.
Hello, Padre Pacha.
Giovanni swallowed audibly. He was deeply shocked, possibly even scared, but Angus already knew he would do everything in his power to hide it in front of her. Giovanni wanted to see her so badly, didn't he? Angus wondered how he felt now that he had finally got what he wished for.
You picked a hell of a moment to arrive.
He was certainly attempting to mask the distress and disbelief shimmering beneath it at how once again Florence seemed to have the upper hand.
You always knew how to make an entrance, didn't you, you vile little witch? I'll give you that. You just couldn't help yourself, could you?
Immediately her lips curved into another eerie little smile.
No, apparently not. I just can't seem to keep away from you, Padre.
As she was speaking, she took a few more steps forward, prowling very slowly as if moving in for the kill. The distance wasn't all that much, so it made it all the more striking how quickly the others shrunk away at the sight of it. Even Giovanni shuffled back a few paces, although managed to recover quicker than the Mexicans in a defiant attempt to hold his ground, and it was only then that he realized she had made herself look more inhuman with makeup. She looked like a demoness, truly. She had even darkened around her eyes. This was clearly an effective source of crowd control, but how long would it last? Even for her. Admittedly, 2 versus 3 are much better odds, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that Giovanni was carrying personal hellfire with him, which could be fatal if they came into contact with it for long enough.
Don't push things too far, Florence.
He urged her silently.
You don't seem very happy to see me, Giovanni. With all those dreams that you have been having about me, Padre. I thought you would be elated. Oh well, just think how disappointed you will feel when I am gone.
For a few moments, Giovanni looked like he was about to bare his teeth.
I'll feel alive, and one day I will put you on trial by hellfire and execute you myself. Make no mistake about that, you sinful bitch.
Yes, indeed. But that day could come and go, and yet your obsession with me would still remain. Obsession is the mother of both genius and madness, Giovanni. Which one are you?
And which are you? I know I could answer for you, but maybe you won't, maybe you can't, or maybe you are just afraid to.
So many maybes. We could hypothesize about it forever, couldn't we? What your ending will be and what will be mine. Are you righteous enough for your God to save you? The thing is, I can already tell you that the ending is always the same. And that same is that it finally ends. Tell me, Giovanni, do you think about me often? Are you turned on right now?
As soon as she said this, Angus found himself catching her eye. It was stupid, he knew. This was maybe the worst possible moment for it, yet somehow he still couldn't help himself, partly because he felt this grandstanding was a waste of time, yet deep down he also knew that it was because this was an aspect of Giovanni he always hated. It was the stark reminder that this was him in the past, the hidden desire, the obsession for her suffering, the vile language and the denial.
Well, this has all been very enjoyable, Giovanni. But I'm afraid the leisure to reminisce about New York is a luxury that I don't currently have. I came here for a reason.
She flexed her shoulders in silent expectation, then slowly dragged her gleaming eyes over each of their faces before settling onto Angus's.
One which would appear to involve all 4 of you.
This entire time, the 2 Mexicans had been glancing nervously from Florence to Giovanni, then back again. It was clear they shared Giovanni's sense of shock and horror, although it had elements in it that reminded Angus of Ariel's speech in The Tempest. Not so much in content, but he could imagine the Mexican ministers being the mutually frantic, panting Gonzalo and Alonso and Giovanni the terrified Sebastian.
Hijo de puta.
He hissed and then spat neatly onto the floor by Angus's feet.
You did this. You think she would be here if it weren't for you? You stupid old man. You come to our beautiful city and bring your slut with you. You should have died long ago, you pathetic old fool.
Before he had even finished, Minister number 2 seized hold of Angus's shoulders and gave him a shake. It was not like it was especially rough, although the contact and words were more than enough to make her eyes narrow into gleaming slits of fury before taking another sharp step forward. The way she moved was so intensely predatory, darting out like a snake or a mantis, and it was fast. It was so fast. Angus actually heard it before he saw it, the dull crack of snapping bone before his body crumpled to the ground, as lifeless and broken as a marionette with severed strings. Giovanni dragged in his breath with a horrified gasp, and then stared numbly at the sidewalk at what just seconds ago was a living, breathing being. For a few agonized seconds, no one either moved or spoke until Minister number 1 let out a gurgling moan of distress.
Daniel.
He dropped to his knees, fumbling around like he thought he could possibly be of use. As if Minister number 2, Daniel, wasn't clearly, violently, shockingly dead. Just as quickly she pounced down herself, coiling his arm around his neck and then hauling him backwards against her chest as her other hand clamped across his mouth to stifle a resulting wail. She made it look so effortless, almost cat-like, with litheness and silent, agile stealth. And Angus now moved forward too to stare at them both, intensely aware of his eerie rupture inside of himself, in which one half was flayed from shock whilst the other burned with anticipation. It was profound, almost unnerving, just this fierce exhilaration that burned even brighter than any dread he might have had previously. He was not even focusing on Giovanni anymore. All he could think about was her.
Patience, senor.
The minister was beginning to thrash within her grip.
I can guarantee that your circumstances will not improve by struggling.
Next to Angus, Giovanni looked ashen. It was easy to guess what he was thinking, that now she had a hostage, the situation had grown a whole lot more complicated, and any small advantage he might previously have had just been lost. For a few seconds her eyes met Giovanni's, and it was clear she was thinking the same. Her smile was still serene, yet there was a distinctly mocking twist to it. "Oh dear, Giovanni," the look was saying. "What are you going to do to stop me now?"
Let him go.
Angus felt sorry for Giovanni. After all, Giovanni already knew she wasn't going to. He was saying it simply because he felt he had to say something, because he had no idea what else to say. It was a sign of desperation and immediately confirmed how out of practice he was in how to deal with her. The Giovanni from New York would never have made an error like this. But in the panic of the moment, and the tormented crush Giovanni had fostered for her over the many months since, meant he was acting irrationally.
That's a tempting suggestion, Giovanni. But I'm afraid I shall have to decline it. No, don't look sad. I promise I will return him to you soon, possibly even in the same condition in which I found him. I'm only here to clarify a few things, then I shall leave you in peace.
As she was speaking, the minister's body gave a sudden, violent flail, and she made a soothing sound between her teeth, and then jerked her elbow a little tighter around his neck until he was forced to go still again. In reality, the minister should have been able to overpower her in an instant, but the mind was a powerful thing, and the minister was utterly convinced that she possessed other worldly powers that would destroy him if he disobeyed her.
The thing is, I could not help but overhear your conversation. What were you describing to Mr. Crawford, senor?
She briefly loosened her hold on the minister's neck, who drew in a shuddering lungful of air and then gulped a few more times before descending into a hacking series of coughs.
About Il Impuro, ex-Chief Minister Brady. Well, he is a suspect in one of the murders. He must give us a satisfactory account of why a witness recognized him.
The urgency of his voice was unmistakable, and it took Angus a few seconds to realize that it was because he thought Florence hated Angus so much that he thought it would somehow appease her by telling her what she wanted to hear.
Must he? Well then, Giovanni, perhaps now you can understand why I am here.
Giovanni raised his eyebrows, and she glanced at him again as her faint smile grew ever so slightly broader.
You know that Angus isn't capable of such blatant sin.
For the first time, Giovanni's rigid veneer of control seemed like it was about to crack.
You are the copycat?
Absolutely. I don't want Angus taking the blame for a sin that was not his.
It was you. What is this, Empusa? Why do you even care about Angus Brady?
Even asking this was another sign of Giovanni's rustiness showing, because Angus already knew she would not answer this directly. And needless to say, she didn't. After all, she hated disclosing too much about her motivations with things. It had taken her months and months to be honest with Angus. There was no way she was going to extend to Giovanni the same privilege.
Trust me, Giovanni. The only person who's dragging Angus Brady into hellfire is me. And I will do it with him alone, and with my bare hands.
Giovanni defensively put his hand on Angus's arm. He looked concerned by this, surprised even, and a little bit envious, although of course he really shouldn't be. Angus and Florence's stories had merged and become the same narrative. Surely he must suspect something, even if he struggled to admit it, because of course she couldn't move on without him. Even in this fantastical, alternate reality version of her that she was spinning to him, she would never have let Angus go.
And so, I want Angus Brady all to myself.
She then gave her elbow an elegant twist around the minister's neck.
And so you see, Senor, I cannot allow you to take him away from me prematurely.
Almost trance-like, Angus found himself glancing down to check his watch. It was impossible, inconceivable, that a mere 5 minutes had passed since she first arrived. Instead, it felt like hours, like a lifetime, because none of this matched his internal script on how things were supposed to go. By now he should have been joining her in exposing them both to Giovanni, but she had given him absolutely no hint of wanting this, and instead just incriminated herself for the copycat murder to ensure suspicion moved off of him, although, if they used their brains, they would realize that this was ridiculous, and if anything, it made him look more guilty. Even now he couldn't quite say for sure why she had chosen to take these actions that she had. Why hadn't she told Giovanni the truth? Why hadn't she tried to kill Giovanni? They had been in search of an ending, he thought wildly. Since the day they had first met, they were always a fresh page begging to be written on, weren't they? A beautiful blank slate. It had been an ongoing struggle to control the pen before finally learning they could share it, but it had also been an exercise in reconstruction where a beginning exists and a conclusion is waiting, and in between are all the fragments of all the stories. It was something which they had crafted together, and it was partly why he was so silent by now, oddly content to let her write this particular chapter. This was her moment, after all. It was what she had been waiting for. If she wanted to set the scene and hope he followed her cues, then he would.
I trust you,
he told her silently.
I'm not going to fight you on this. Whatever you do, I'll support you, whether it's to tell the truth or lie.
Right on cue, the minister let out another strangled gasp as Giovanni quickly held out both hands palm upwards, an appeasing, slightly submissive gesture that he could easily guess how much he despised having to make.
Okay, ex-Chief Minister Brady is not getting arrested. But look, just let this guy go. He's only doing his job. He thought the evidence was there, so he acted on it. Just let him go.
As Angus watched, she started to smile again.
By all means.
Before she had even finished speaking, she uncurled her arm from the minister's neck and then grabbed hold of his shoulders and gave him a vicious shove. He shot forward like an arrow from a bow to plunge straight into Giovanni's abdomen. He gasped with pain and then buckled at his knees as all the breath rushed right out of his lungs. Without missing a beat, she dove forward herself and then neatly seized Giovanni's head in both hands and slammed it straight against the brick wall. It was violent, shocking, and as he crumpled onto the sidewalk, Angus gave a pained gasp of his own, yet even from where Angus was standing, he could still see the rise and fall of his chest. He was unconscious, not dead. Florence hadn't killed him. It was at this moment that he finally understood the outcome that he had been agonizing over for months had finally happened, and Florence had told him nothing. It was clear that she had ignored her own preference and not revealed their relationship to Giovanni, and for no other reason than because she knew Angus might have changed his mind. Perhaps it would have come out tonight over dinner. Maybe a part of him knew that he would never be able to go through with his twisted revenge fantasy on Giovanni. But it turned out she knew anyway, without him having to say a word, simply because she knew him. There were so many questions he wanted to ask her right now, so many things he wanted to say, yet none of them were possible, and all of them would have to wait because there was currently a very large problem to be dealt with in the form of the Mexican minister, just like Giovanni, very much alive and now crouching like a cornered rat as he glared toward Florence with panicked, furious eyes. This was Angus's cue to act. He could already tell. She was passing the pen over to him to finish the chapter, and in a way, it felt like a sort of crossroads, because there was such a clear set of directions for where things could possibly go. He supposed the most obvious would be to replicate what he did with Carly, certainly the safest and most sensible option, which would be to warn the minister she was too dangerous to pursue, and then find a way to keep him occupied until she had time to make her escape. He could tend to Giovanni and then go inside afterward to give a statement, pretending he was as shocked and traumatized as everyone else was whilst they waited for the retinue of ambulances and squad cars to arrive. Yeah, there was no doubt he could do that. Most likely he should. A part of him undoubtedly wanted to. Except in the end, he didn't do any of that. He simply charged straight at the minister instead. The minister gave a startled yell of surprise, and this time Angus didn't even need to look at her to know that she was smiling. For a few seconds, the minister hunched down, feral and vicious with bared teeth, before finally seeming to accept he couldn't fight his way past Angus to the safety of the cathedral, and abruptly twisted out of reach instead. The minister's movement as he sprinted down the alleyway was so disjointed and slithering in the flickering streetlight that he looked like a giant insect, and he was much, much faster than Angus expected. Although he supposed he had to be, didn't he? He's running for his life. The difference was, though, that Angus was running for Florence, and it provided a maddened surge of speed which made it relatively easy to catch up with him within as little as 50 yards before seizing hold of his arm. He let out a low, bestial grunt that was more like an animal than a human being, and when he finally turned around, he could immediately see his look of disbelief. He was like Giovanni earlier, the sense of being taken at his word. And Angus didn't even blame him for it, because how could he possibly have known the fact he had been scheming so hard to take Angus down when all along Angus really was the source of threat that the Mexican ministers had been hoping they could frame him as? Florence had said it herself, hadn't she, that first time she came to the cathedral.
What would they say if they knew exactly what they had taken into their midst? Bringing a predator straight into the fold. The proverbial wolf in sheep's clothing.
Roughly, Angus wrapped his hand around the minister's throat and then pushed him up against the wall. In the darkness, Angus could still see the oily sheen of sweat on his forehead. Could smell his fear and outrage, how hot and rank it was.
You?
Yes, me.
From behind them came a sudden pad of footsteps, very slow and measured with an eerie echoing quality that seemed to amplify each time they moved across the stone. They started quietly at first, only gradually growing louder and clearer, and there was no doubt something about their relentless pace which managed to be infinitely more sinister than running. When she drew to a halt beside him, he was almost entirely in a shadow. leaving nothing but a gleam of eyes in the depths of her face and the sweep of her long dark coat.
Me too.
At the sound of her voice, the minister's face visibly seemed to spasm, a layer of jerking muscle which leaped and convulsed as if beetles were crawling beneath his skin. His manner had the same snarling ferocity of a rabid animal, yet whilst in theory it made him more reckless and lethal, it did nothing to deter Angus from moving even closer to him, to tighten his grip. Then for a few wild seconds, all Angus could think about was their child and what kind of parents they were going to be. The fact she hadn't been running meant she wasn't out of breath, and it gave her presence a strange additional smouldering layer of menace and authority. He leaned into her slightly without even thinking about it, and immediately felt her warm palm against his back. The minister repeated the same grunting sound as before, an urgent blend of fear and raw, reeking aggression. His eyes were darting frantically backward and forward, seeking an escape route that was never going to appear, until he finally managed to wrench out of Angus's grip before stooping down to retrieve a discarded wine bottle and then smashing it against the wall. The edge of the glass gave an ugly glint in the moonlight, rough and jagged as a set of broken teeth, and for a few moments there was just sinister inertia on both sides as he stood in front of Angus like a blasted slab of stone, whilst his eyes pierced the shadows and his tongue glistened through the gaping hole of his mouth. Angus could already sense he was going to try and attack Florence, and the knowledge of this made his sense of rage and revulsion so strong that the air almost seemed to be choked with them. It was as if they were starting to cloud his vision, like a veil of red gauze draped across his face, yet neither of them spoke or moved. Then the minister took a final step forward, raising the bottle as he did so, and it was this gesture that finally jolted something inside of Angus and made him come rushing back to himself. He was only gone for a few seconds, yet it felt like another lifetime before something shifted, and the world was no longer monochrome and slow, but fast-paced, pulsating, and saturated in color, shades of scarlet, shot through with silver and crimson.
You bitch. That's enough. Rot in hell.
As he spoke, he darted forward to swipe at Florence in a series of loping strides, and at the sight of it, Angus could feel himself lose control completely. It didn't matter that she may have been more than capable of defending herself, or that he was limited in the extent of any damage he could do. None of that mattered at all, and instinctively he just forced her out of the way before lunging at the minister himself. How dare he? He found himself thinking. He was not fit to even look at her, let alone touch her. No one touches her but him. The edge of the bottle caught the light again, and for a few frenzied moments it was all crawling shadows and flashes of silver as the minister let out a roar and then grappled with Angus until there was a sudden explosion of pain in his ribs as the world went white, then red. His chest felt like it had caught fire, but it still never occurred to him to scream or stop or do anything except duck away from the crazily swinging glass before diving straight back in again. It was clear he had expected Angus to give up. He was counting on it. Already Angus could see the look of fear and surprise that was starting to flicker over his face when it finally dawned on him that Angus wouldn't. As Angus swung around again, the minister grunted and then ground his teeth, faltering for a few seconds before attempting to smash his fist into Angus's damaged ribs. It was a decidedly underhand move, of course, the type of thing that would have no place in an honorable fight, but he didn't waste time resenting it when he knew that any real notion of honor was left behind at the gates of the cathedral. In this respect, the minister was still rasping and snarling at him, yet it was so hard to listen anymore to the rambling stream of words like betrayal, disrespect, injustice, noble, weighty words that belong in a courtroom or on the pages of some moralizing novel, yet lose all their meaning in a scene like this where justice and nobility no longer have any value. No one here was noble. They didn't subscribe to conventional ideas of morality. Not Florence, not the minister, and certainly not Angus. He was just so sick of this now. He was sick of the whole thing. On cue, the glass came slicing through the air again, whistling past Angus's ear with a shrill high wail, like something crying, so he hissed with anger as he was forced to lose precious seconds ducking to avoid it. By now, Florence was almost invisible among the shadows, observing everything that was taking place. She wouldn't intervene unless he asked her to, though, because she understood that Angus felt it was far too dangerous in her current state, but also because she thought that Angus wanted this one to himself. And he did. The first one was hers, but this second one, this kill was his, and each time they both had done it on behalf of the other. Angus's chest was already throbbing fiercely from the stab wound, yet he had completely forgotten it in the thrill of the hunt as he focused on an anger that was so burning and powerful it obliterated everything else. Besides, there was no time anymore for weakness or injury because he was currently in the center of his very own killing ground, a personal amphitheater for a fight to the death. Instead, Angus delivered a sharp punch to the minister's abdomen and then quickly kicked his feet out from under him until he collapsed onto the floor and Angus could pounce down to straddle him with his full weight on the minister's chest. Behind him, he could feel Florence shift slightly, and once more he didn't need to see her face to know that she was partially worried for his safety, but also partially pleased with this result. Underneath Angus, the minister's face was bleached pale in the moonlight, and Angus knew that his own must look the same, like two solitary ghosts confronting one another amid the shadows, like two lost souls. In his ears, his heart had started to pulse even louder with anticipation, and it was a weird, unnatural rhythm that was dramatically different from how it had pounded so fearfully earlier in the evening before she had arrived. Then Angus released a long breath he hadn't even realized he had been holding, gazing down at what had now become his prey, with a face that was cold and set. He was nearly trance-like in his calmness, and it was a profoundly odd sensation, as if he had taken a step sideways out of time and was hovering overhead, watching himself and waiting. On one level, he knew what he was doing was wrong. This was a fellow clergyman, and a good man, at least in comparison to him. Angus knew there was still time to change his mind, still time to avoid the risk of consequences for what he was about to do. But ultimately none of that was even enough to make him pause, as he took hold of the minister's head in his hands, which were totally steady, and then slowly drew it forward before slamming it back against the stone. It made a slickly nauseating sound that was straight from an abattoir as he did it again, then again, until his skull finally splintered open and his life gushed out across the pavement and drenched it scarlet. There was a certain brutal elegance to it, wasn't there? He had always thought so. How swiftly, simply, and beautifully a human body could be breached and broken apart. In the end, he had no idea how long the whole thing had lasted, although whatever it was, it seemed that it must be over by now. All of it done in the blink of an eye, whilst blazing with every possible sensation. Blood, breath, bone, skin, an orgy of destruction that commemorated the death of the old, even as it consummated the start of something new. At the very least, he supposed it had been over long enough for him to stand up and speak to her, only somehow he found that he was not ready to do so. He hid the injury so well, she didn't even know he had been hurt yet, but he knew she would realize as soon as she saw him, and he felt like he wanted to wait a little longer until she found out. Just a few more seconds would be enough. Just enough time to let his eyes fall closed as he bathed in the newfound sense of peace. He felt so profoundly at ease now, serene, almost, even though he knew it was wrong to be so, to feel so calm after what he had just done. He could see the blood on his clothes and hands, dark and thick, curiously shiny, making him think of Florence going through this twice before, and alone. Was it as quiet for her as it was for him once the sound of the fight had died? So hushed and reverent, wasn't it? Nothing to hear at all except the way his breath was seeping up his chest before sinking back in again. Just them alone in the moonlight, in purgatory, in the midst of the carnage and deformed delights, a beautifully broken tragedy, yet aware of a haunting sense of contentment, in spite of it, that burnt like purification. Without even thinking about it, he now murmured her name, and then got to his feet and moved forwards, reaching out with both arms until he had enveloped her and held her close. A single cheekbone stroking against his hair like a comfort of cherishing hands. There was blood everywhere now. He didn't know what was his and what was the minister's, but it was not like it really mattered. It was all the essence of victory and power.
Angus, you are hurt. Why didn't you tell me?